My talk to you today is going to be about Cuba. My talk to you today is going to be as an advisor to the Brookings Institution, and also, by the way, an advisor to the Cuba Task Force at the Council of the Americas. And my comments in no way represent the views of the University of Miami in any way, shape, or form. I also spoke this morning to a group of about 200 plus folks at UCF Life, and we talked about Chavez, we talked about Lula, we talked about energy, which was one of the issues that Secretary Clinton put forward as far as of a new Latin American energy. So even though my talk is going to be focused on Cuba, I'll be more than happy to take any questions from the audience vis-a-vis Chavez, Brazil. What is the future Lula when the new elections come out are going to look like, particularly when we think that Brazil is going to become the largest producer of oil in Latin America, surpassing Venezuela? What is the role of China in the region vis-a-vis oil? I think that's terribly important, strategic to us. So I'm just going to tease you a bit with those subjects in case you do want to go ahead and ask me some questions. Let me present to you what we went through at Brookings. And again, I'm looking more for a conversation between yourselves and myself. So I will leave a lot of things open on purpose, because really what I would like to have is an interaction with the audience. But about 3 years ago, Brookings Institution decided that there was a time for a review of Cuba policy. Not only was it a time for a review of our objectives, but there was also time to review whatever the strategic and/or tactical approach was to that objective vis-a-vis Cuba. And what Brookings went about to do was something that to me has never happened before. And that is, they got together, eventually there were 19 of us, 19 quote-unquote Cuba experts, of which only 5 of us were Cuban Americans. The rest were folks from Europe, from Latin America, former diplomats, ex-military folks, academia. It was quite a mixed group. If you look at those of us that represented the Cuban American community, just to give you an indication of who was in that room, you had people like Pepe Hernandez, who is chairman of the Cuban American Foundation, somebody that in our community we see as extreme right. And we had folks like Carlos Saladrigas from the Cuba Study Group, people that are viewing our community as extreme left of the Cuba debate. So what Brookings really tried to do is bring a group of people of mixed ideas, a group of people who had different cultural and historical heritage vis-a-vis Cuba. 3 former ambassadors to Cuba from the UK, from Canada, and from Mexico were part of the group. And again, for 18 months, we went through a series of scenario planning and future mapping exercises. This was actually work. At first, when we got invited, we said, well, we'll probably have a couple of meetings and that will be it. Let me tell you, it was work. The study concluded in November of 2008. We did not have any idea what the new administration was going to look like. In fact, throughout the whole process, we interviewed dozens and dozens of stakeholders, dozens and dozens of people that will eventually influence the direction of our report. And we talked to people from the Clinton administration. We talked to folks from the Obama administration, McCain. So the input of our end product, again, sometime in November, was with no expectation or no forward-looking idea of what the new administration was going to be like. It's an extensive report. For those of you that eventually would like to take a look at it, you can go into the Brookings webpage and really pull it out. But again, what's important was that it was a scenario planning. We hire experts, particular folks that work with the Defense Department and State Department in doing scenario planning and future mapping exercises. So it was an organized, disciplined approach to the question of Cuba. We had a variety of experts, mixed experts from both sides of the spectrum. And then we decided to agree on certain things at the beginning. And this is very important, and I hope you listen to me just for 2 seconds if there is anything on this conversation that I'd like you to leave with. What we all agree with at the beginning was that the original objective for the last 50 years of the US administration or the US government toward Cuba of regime change, the objective has been regime change. And the strategic or the tactic or the objectives by which we worked toward reaching that goal was political and economic isolation, i.e. the embargo, did not work, has not worked. We all reached that conclusion. It wasn't the issue whether we ought to lift the embargo or not. That's not the debate. The first debate was, is there any discussion, is there any disagreement within the group that the objective of regime change and the strategy or tactics of political and economic isolation vis-a-vis Cuba in order to reach that objective of regime change have worked? And everybody agree. No, it has not given us the results that we expected. Based on that then, what we said is, can we then have a debate from a totally clean slate of what we think then our approach should be? What do we recommend to this administration? How do we need to move forward then if the existing plan of the last 50 years hasn't worked? We were talking to someone earlier and we said, if this was the private sector and this was a marketing strategy and we would have been fired on year 2. Because year after year, the strategic plan, the business plan to reach the objective was the same and there was no solution. The government's still in place. The things that we wanted to accomplish have not been accomplished in 50 years. It is very important also to bring to the table that we probably worked on different, I think there were about 23 or 26 different scenarios that we worked through. We ended up with 3 buckets, i.e. as far as the future of Cuba is concerned. Again, future of Cuba vis-a-vis the next 5 to 7 year window. That's what we were looking at. We were not looking at past 10 years. We said if anything is going to happen, again, because of biological change of the Cuban regime leadership, and also because there was going to be a new administration in Washington, we said the window of opportunity is going to be somewhere between 5 and 7 years. We ended up putting our scenarios in 3 buckets. One bucket is what we call succession. And succession was basically the institutionalization of the new leadership. The political model doesn't change, the economic model doesn't change. All that happens is that the baton is passed from a Fidel Castro to a Raúl Castro and another group of senior leaders. And we call that succession. And I think we ended up like 3 or 4 different scenarios within the succession bucket. The third bucket, which was the most promising bucket, was what we call transition. And what we meant by transition was that there was actual physical movement, that there was actual change in the model, in both the political model and in the economic model. We were not talking about cosmetic changes. For example, the recent change in Cuba that now Cubans can own cell phones, or that now Cubans can enter hotels, which before they could not, that doesn't mean anything to us, because it does not represent a structural change of the political and/or economic model. So transition in Cuba will take place when we see the first changes in the political and economic structure. The third bucket, which was the one that nobody wanted, was that of a failed state. And believe it or not, is the one that recently we're more concerned about vis-a-vis Venezuela. In other words, what happens if there is a power vacuum in Cuba? What happens if that power vacuum comes about by 3 main catalysts? Number 1, because Cuba then all of a sudden with the loss of Venezuela loses its economic support, and there is basically economic collapse of the Cuban economy. What happens if there is a change in the top leadership? And that top leadership doesn't have the political weight to maintain discipline through that process of change. And then third, raise expectations. Raul Castro comes in. If you look at his December speech before the People's Assembly in 2006, if you look at his 26th of July speech also in 2006, he's promising a lot of changes. What happens if there is raised expectations and all of a sudden the government doesn't deliver, and for the first time ever since the Maliconazo in the early 90s, Cubans literally physically go out in the streets and we have basically civil unrest. So those were the three buckets. Succession, no change. Things continue like they are as long as the current cadre of folks that are, I guess the mean age is 76 when you look at it, as long as those guys continue to be around. And remember, people like Laje and Felipe Pérez Roque are no longer there. The issue of transition, which I'm going to end up with that, and then the failed state, which certainly none of us would like to have. I want to address what we then came out was that we need to focus on transition. And in order to have transition, we need to have what we call constructive dialogue. And one of the things for those of us, I traveled to Cuba. I have traveled so far. Last year I went 5 times. So I do travel to the island. I'm not one of those guys that sits in Miami and tries to predict what's going on in Cuba just because I read Grandma every day or the Miami Herald, but I do try to get out. But one of the things that we found out is that there are actually 2 Cubas. I mean, there's Cuba of the leadership, and then there's the el cubano de la calle, Cuban of the street. When you meet him, he or she does want change. It might not be necessarily political change, it might be economic change, but they do want change. So what we recognize is we need to have what we call in Brookings constructive engagement. And basically when you read the report, that's what the report is based on. Constructive engagement. We did not talk about lifting the embargo. That's silent. You would not find lifting the embargo anywhere here, because we felt that that wasn't constructive to our goals. And our goal is to reach that Cuban population, that young population, those folks that are either professionals, those folks that are, by the way, in the armed forces, those folks that are academia, those folks in Cuba that are in the state enterprises, that are in their 40s and 50s and 30s. Believe me, they do recognize what they're going through. They might have some allegiance to the revolution, to the original ideals of the revolution, but they know better than anybody else that a change needs to come about, and they're willing to be part of that change. Our question was, how do we engage them? If we continue to lock them in a closet, and we continue to hold on to that closet door, how can we engage those people so that they understand and they learn what the processes are going to be and what they need to do for that period of transition? One of the main things that we also discussed that was very important, and by the way, is discussing Havana all the time, is the change that the Cuban American community has had. And it's also a generational change. It's just like the change in Havana with the leadership, the same generational change is taking place in Miami. I'm an historico. I came to the US at the early age of 11 in 1960 with my parents. My parents already passed away. They died in their 90s here in the US. Their politics certainly is different than mine, even though maybe our goals and our morals and ethics and values of where Cuba ought to go are the same. Their objectives of how to reach it are certainly different than mine. Here I am now, a new generation, a different generation of Cuban who has a different approach. And then you have my children who were born here who certainly have a total different idea of how Cuba ought to be handled. So what we're finding in Miami is not only a generational change from those of us that are historicos, but also because the community has changed. I mean, there are a lot of Cuban Americans today in Miami who are voters also, by the way, who came to the US 1970, 90, 1980s, 1990s, whose politics are totally different from those of us that came to this country in the early 60s. So we have to also understand that there's a difference of thought, there's a difference of ideas in Miami today that wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. Two more things that I want to touch base on. One was an issue that Secretary Clinton touched base, and that is that we believe that Cuba today, by the way, it is one of the vehicles by which, or at least we thought, and we recommended that to the administration, by the way, when we presented to them this document in April of 2009, that Cuba was really the vehicle by which the United States could present its new face to Latin America. In other words, if there was an issue in Latin America that for the first time Latin America vis-a-vis is really in the opposite side of the table and with the United States, is Cuba. I mean, the fact that every single Latin American country today has diplomatic relations with Cuba, when that wasn't the case in the 60s, and when the case is that every single, with the exception of 3 countries in the United Nations, every year votes to lift the embargo, we felt then that this administration could certainly then use Cuba as a vehicle by which to reapproach its Latin American politics. Certainly that's the way that Lula saw it. And Lula, in more than one occasion, expressed that to President Obama. He expressed that to President Obama in Trinidad and Tobago, and at least in one more occasion. That is, here you have an opportunity to begin talking and addressing a new Latin America through your Cuba policy. That, regrettably, has not happened. I can share with you that out of the 16 primary recommendations that the Brookings Institution put forward, this administration has enacted, or we are aware that they're working toward, 9 of them. So we're extremely pleased that 9 of our 16 primary recommendations have been taken into consideration by this administration. The one that we're probably the most disappointed is the people-to-people travel. Again, remember, we did not address the embargo, and we did not address lifting the travel ban. We can talk about that in a minute if you wish. But one of the things that we did promote is the people-to-people travel, which, by the way, was one of the things that Clinton did have on the table back in 2004. And that is, let's allow, whether they're universities, musical groups, little league teams, professional organizations, let them travel to Cuba and engage Cuba's civil society. The beauty of that program is that it was going to be a two-way program. In other words, we were going to open also our institutions for Cubans from the island to come to the US. Let more basketball teams and baseball teams come to the US and play. Let students from the University of Havana or the University of Oriente or the University of Camagüey, let them come to University of Central Florida. That, of course, is not going to happen. So again, it would have lifted one of the arguments. And it would have also put on top of the table the difficulty that the Cuban people have in going outside and learning and opening doors and having an open discussion. So to us, we were extremely disappointed when the President of the United States agreed on lifting the travel restrictions of Cuban Americans and did not include the people-to-people travel. We felt that the political cost of this administration, once they did that, adding people-to-people travel was going to be minimal. If the Cuban American community in South Florida, your 400,000 plus voters, which is really what's the power behind that group, if you were going to get them upset about lifting the travel ban, go ahead and, they're not going to get, the situation is not going to get any worse politically if you add people to people. And by the way, individuals like Pepe Hernandez with the Cuban American Foundation were in favor of people to people. So this wasn't an issue that only the left-wing group in Miami were concerned or in favor of. This is something that all of us felt that it was a good political risk that we could take of people-to-people travel. That was not implemented. Let me finish by saying that, let me address for a minute the lifting of the travel restrictions. We had a very, very difficult debate on travel restrictions Because everyone in that room, including the 6 or 7 of us that were Cuban Americans, happened also to be American citizens. This country was good enough that it gave me constitutionally the right to become a citizen. So even though I was born in Cuba, even though I have, my heart might be in Havana, I have loyalty to this country because this country gave me rights and privileges that I have never had. So the question that we put before the group is, for a minute, let's take our Cuban hat off. And we ask the question, from a constitutional point of view, why can Jorge Pinon tomorrow, I can get on an airplane tomorrow and travel to Havana, no questions asked, either in Havana or in the US. And my neighbor, who happens to be John Smith, cannot go to Havana. He can travel to South Korea, he can travel to to North Korea, he can travel to Vietnam, he can travel everywhere. So the issue of travel to Cuba, when we discussed it in our group, we tried to discuss it from a constitutional point of view. And that is the way that still many of us look at it. There are those in our community that say, well, by opening Cuba to tourists, which is not necessarily tourists, you're going to give the regime an economic lifeline that otherwise they would not have. Well, we've been trying to shut off that economic lifeline for the last 50 years, and they're still here. A lot of us also question if really the million-plus American tourists that all of a sudden are going to be descending in Havana, if that's really going to be a reality. When you talk to Cubans in Havana, people higher up, they said, well, we're going to have to be careful. By the way, this topic in Havana is a two-edged sword. Folks in Cuba will say, yes, we need them. Let them come from an economic point of view. But from the political point of view, many people in Cuba are worried. It says we cannot have thousands of young people walking around here with Time magazines or Newsweek magazines under their arms and new ideas going all over the island. How do we manage this? How do we manage the groups that are coming in? Recently, as you know, they returned a group of church members from Portland, Oregon, that were going to Cuba. So how are they going to manage all of these Americans going over there if they're going to work on a particular church group? Whether they're Baptists or Methodists, how are you going to restrict them? So for the Cuban government, it's going to be quite a nightmare to really manage, I don't know what the number is going to be, but manage whether it's 500,000 or 800,000 or 1 million Americans traveling to Cuba. It's going to be a political headache. Is it going to be an economic bonanza? Are they now going to sell or fill more hotel rooms and make more money that will go to the state enterprises and to the Council of State? Sure. So the issue of the travel restrictions certainly is one that is conflictive, but again, we have avoided it. In summary about Cuba, and then I'll briefly talk about, somebody's going to give me a time on, so what I would like to do is, let me wrap up Cuba. Let me go to Venezuela, touch on Petrocaribe real quick, and Brazil, and then open it for Q&A. The issue of Cuba is that the current leadership, remember the average age is about 76. To us, their political lifeline, not their biological lifeline, but their political lifeline, we believe that it's no longer than 5, maybe 7 years. So for the first time in the last 50 years, we do see a light at the end of the tunnel. We don't know what the speed of that light is. We don't know when it's going to be next to us. But we certainly need to engage that change, because what we don't want is a failed state. A failed state will bring in the drug cartels. The failed state will bring in maybe as many as 500,000 new Cuban immigrants into South Florida, for example, escaping for a total economic collapse of Cuba. A failed state will bring about total disorder and undiscipline in the streets. And then how do we handle that? Is the U.S. ready to handle that scenario? Our answer, and again, we had a bunch of experts, was we are not. We're not politically, by the way. It's not an issue of having the assets necessary to handle a failed state like that. Do we have the political will to then go into Cuba and take care of Cuba? And again, that the future belongs to the Cuban people. There are 11 million people in Cuba today that are the ones that eventually will have to determine what their way of life is. It is not up to 600 or 700 or 800,000 of us Cuban Americans that live outside of Cuba. It's up to the Cuban people to determine what their future is going to be. What we have to give them is the tools necessary for them to reach that decision in a free environment. Yes, there are political prisoners in Cuba. Yes, there is no freedom of the press in Cuba. Yes, there is no freedom. I mean, we can go through the whole list, and I agree with all of you. The answer is yes. The question is then, how do we empower the Cuban people so that they can make their own decision of where their future ought to go? And we at Brookings felt that the only way to reach that goal is through constructive engagement. Let me spend 5 minutes on Chavez. Mr. Chavez yesterday announced an energy crisis. Venezuela is about to have the biggest apagón is a blackout, that the country has ever had in their life. I mean, basically what happened in Venezuela is that, again, from a stewardship point of view, they put all their eggs in one basket, and 70% of Venezuela's energy comes from hydro. So of course they have had huge drought for the last 2 years, so there's no water to run their hydroelectric plants. So I don't care how much oil they have, oil is not going to get them out of a bind. They're having difficulty. Venezuela today is about 3 million barrels a day of production. Their goal is to double that production to 6 million barrels a day by the year 2015. No way they'll do it. The only thing that will help Mr. Chavez, of course, is if the price of oil again surpasses the $100 mark, and we don't foresee that happening, certainly not in this year, as long as the world economic situation continues to be what it is. You saw Ramiro Valdez, who is probably Cuba's number 3 man today, in Caracas last week, trying to, quote unquote, help Venezuela with its challenge. And the reason that they need to help Venezuela with the challenge is because 60% of Cuba's oil comes from Venezuela, and on top of that, they get another between $3 and $5 billion of subsidies from Venezuela. So if Cuba already went through a periodo especial during the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, you can imagine what's going to happen to Cuba if by any chance there is a regime change in Caracas. Cuba's Achilles heel today is Venezuela. Venezuela collapses, then you will have, we all agree, you will have a failed state in your hands within 2 weeks in Cuba. So Venezuela is very important vis-a-vis Cuba and also the politics of the region. Brazil. We love to talk about Brazil. Many of you remember that when Lula came, many of us said, boy, this is going to be trouble. Here's a populist president, come from the labor movement, and really has taught us a lesson on how to govern smartly, how to let the government institutions or the state enterprises that knew, i.e. Petrobras, that knew how to run the business, leave them out of the politics and let them really run their business. That is the difference, by the way, we were talking about earlier today. I was talking to UCF Live program folks this morning, and we were talking about the difference between Venezuela and Brazil. And the difference between Venezuela and Brazil was stewardship. It's not oil, it's not power, it's not money, it's stewardship. How many times do we see people that win the lottery and within a year they're bankrupt? And that's what Mr. Chavez lacks. He lacks stewardship. He lacks a mission by which to run the enterprise, which is not the case with President Lula in Brazil. The question then that we have is, what is the new administration in Brasilia going to look like once they have elections and a new president is elected with a very, very wealthy Brazil? Remember, we expect that by the year 2015, Brazil is going to be the largest producer of oil in Latin America, surpassing both Mexico and Venezuela. Recently, China loaned Petrobras $10 billion for their oil sector. Brazil beginning this year, China beginning this year is going to start receiving 250,000 barrels a day of Brazilian oil that they're going to start taking to China. So China is also playing a very important role, particularly in the energy sector in the region, in countries like Ecuador, Venezuela, and Brazil. So you have Venezuela going in one direction. You have Brazil certainly going in another direction. You have Mexico, a country in which I lived for 5 years, and to me is really, in a way, is my second home. And it is sad in Mexico today when you see the way the country is going. A country that used to be producing in excess of 3.3, 3.4 million barrels a day, today is producing about 2.8, 2.9 million barrels of oil a day, and that number continues to decline because their constitution does not allow them to form partnership with international oil companies. So again, Mexico has locked itself in an economic scenario which on the long term really doesn't look good at all. And then you have countries like Chile, for example, and Bolivia, and the folks in the southern cone in Argentina, who in a way are finding their own way of how to survive this economic crisis. You know, Chile to me, I'm an economics major and that's usually my niche, but if you look at the politics of Chile, even on the different governments, it's just unbelievable how they run the ship. How, again, we go back to stewardship. How their political ideology, they're able to maintain their political ideology away from how do we run the machine? How do we optimize our resources? How do we optimize this nation and the things that we have that makes it productive? Let's not tinker with it. For many years, Chile depended on natural gas from Bolivia via Argentina, and because of a number of reasons, they were always tinker and they always had problems with. Finally, Chile said enough, we're going to go to LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, and today, and within the next 10 years, Chile is no longer going to depend on Bolivia or Argentina for their own natural gas, and Chile is actually going to become a country with basically no oil production whatsoever, is going to become energy independent from the point of view that they're turning their industry to natural gas, and by building LNG plants, they can bring now LNG from Algeria, they can bring it from Nigeria, from Angola, from Trinidad and Tobago, from a bunch of different suppliers. Diversification, they haven't put all of their eggs in one basket. So Chile is a wonderful, wonderful story. Colombia is another one of those that we always look at it from the private sector, and when you look at the economic return and the way that they manage their economic enterprises, it's another one of those success stories. Colombia has a bad rap. Colombia has a bad history. I remember every time when I was President of AMACO Latin America, and we always had to go to the board of directors in Chicago and sell Colombia. The issue with Colombia was not the internal rate of return that we were getting in our projects in Colombia. They were wonderful. The problem with Colombia was that the board members were always concerned about security, safety, drugs. That's what really bogged Colombia down. But Colombia is a beautiful country, a country that really, from an economic point of view, I think once they get their house in order, vis-a-vis drugs and cartels and all of the difficulties that they have, I think Colombia is one of those fantastic stories that we're going to have in our hemisphere for many years to come. Again, to summarize it, Secretary Clinton addressed the issue of energy when President Obama went to Trinidad and Tobago. She talked about Honduras. She talked about a lot of things that politically are nice, but really you have to take action. You have to show leadership. And we at Brookings felt, and we still feel, that if you really want to address the rest of Latin America, if you really want to take action, Cuba offers you that opportunity. We're very glad to hear that the talks this month in February are still on schedule for migration and postal services. So that's promising. So we continue to encourage this administration to engage Cuba. We continue to encourage this administration to engage Brazil. We think that's going to be very important. We continue to encourage administration to discount, and they have done a good job so far, to avoid Venezuela, avoid the rhetoric of Mr. Chavez, let him play to his audience, but really don't get involved in that. And then we have to find a solution to Mexico. Mexico is very difficult for us because it is a country that shares a border with the United States. So the impact that Mexico could have, both economically and politically on this country, it's very, very important. In fact, from the oil point of view, the energy point of view, many of us are more concerned about Mexico than we are about Venezuela. Again, I want to thank you, all of you, for the opportunity that you have given me to come here. There are a lot of details that went into Brookings and Cuba. I'm sure you might have some questions. Any questions that you have, it was funny at the talk this morning, we started talking about Venezuela and Mexico and so on, and the conversation turned into oil prices. I guess whenever an oil man gets on top of before a microphone, it's a good idea to bring out a 2x4 and start asking why we have $4 or $3 a gallon gasoline. So we had a lot of fun about that. We did talk about ethanol. We did talk about sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. So we talked about a lot of good things this morning. So again, I'm open to any of your questions that you want to address. Thank you.
Please comment on Peru. I know they have connections in China, but you never mentioned Peru. How are they in all this situation?
Peru and Ecuador are two Andean countries that, again, from a natural resources point of view, they have a lot of potential. But their fiscal and political stability and continuity has not been good enough to attract the interest of foreign investment and so on. China did loan Ecuador $1 billion, again, for their oil sector. And Ecuador is going to be supplying China, I believe it's with about 35 or 40,000 barrels a day of Oriente crude also beginning this year. The potential of Peru, of course, is natural gas with their Camisea project. The advantage that Peru has, for example, vis-a-vis Bolivia, is that they do have an outlet to the ocean. Remember, the challenge with Bolivia is that they do have natural gas. By the way, they have probably 10 times more natural gas than Peru, but the problem with Bolivia is that they're landlocked. Those of you that are history majors or Latin Americanists know that going back to the wars that they had with Chile and so on, Bolivia lost its outlet to the sea. So the only customer that Bolivia has really is Brazil. And we were talking earlier this morning that now, by the way, with all of the new natural gas and oil finds of Brazil, it's going to come the day that Brazil is not going to need Bolivia anymore. So Bolivia is going to have its challenges. But Peru, the issue with Ecuador is a difficult one because of the old Texaco stories. Many of you, by the way, that really want to do a research paper or do some work, go and take a look at what what Texaco did in Ecuador 20, 25 years ago from an environmental point of view, how they manage Ecuador, that's still hanging. So it's hanging now today with Chevron because Chevron, of course, bought Texaco, so Chevron inherited the problems that they have with Ecuador. Again, both Ecuador and Peru, from the energy point of view, I think they have a good storyline, they have a good future. The issue is continuity. When people ask me why, when an oil company goes to a country, and I negotiated many contracts with state oil companies, what do you guys look for? Do you really look for an internal rate of return? Do you actually look for economics? Do you actually look for, how much money do you guys want to make? We really don't look at that. When we go back to the board of directors, the question that we're asked is continuity. Remember, to us, oil in a way is like a game of poker. No, think of that. We really go in not knowing if there's oil or not. So it's a gambling step that we're going through and we go in. And what we want to do is we want to sit at a poker table in which we know what the rules of the game are. And we want to sit and play the game as long as the rules don't change in the middle of the game. Oil companies are risk takers. That's our business. That's why people invest in oil companies instead of putting your money on a CD in the bank, because we're risk takers. We manage our risks. But whenever I go to the board and sell a project, it's not necessarily whether a particular project offers me a 13 internal rate of return or a 16 or a 17. In fact, I have had projects approved at the 10 internal rate of return, a 10 IR level that I never thought that they were going to be approved. But it got approved because the particular country we went to, it had a good track record that we were going to be able to make that 10% for 5, 10, 15 years. Today, a project in the Soviet Union, in Russia, today, if you want to take a project to Russia, and you take it to a board of directors, you're going to need an internal rate of return of 18 or maybe 20%. Why is it so high? Is it because the economic risk is there? Is it because the technical? No. It's because the issue of continuity. If I go to Russia today and invest $5 billion in a project, what are the chances that within 3 years a new government is going to come in and say, oh, by the way, we don't like the way that deal was done, we're going to redo it. So again, yes, Ecuador and Peru, I think a very good horizon, very positive. The question is there going to be continuity and stability both in their fiscal and legal?
Is there a sort of uniformity among children, your kids' age, to say let's forget all this nonsense and get into Cuba, or is that all over the board as well?
If you look at the polls that have done at FIU, and again anecdotal with my own children, by the way, my 4 children who are now in their late 30s, who were born here in the U.S., purposely, 98 and 99, we took them to Cuba. And it's interesting, anecdotal, again, just to show the difficulty. I don't know how many Cuban Americans are here in the audience. But when Maria Antonia and I decided, we already had gone to Cuba. We went to Cuba when the Pope visited Cuba. And when we came back, we said, we got to go back again, and we need to take the kids with us. When we put the idea before my 4 children, their first question was, what is grandfather going to say? APA. Their whole concern was APA. And this is a true story. We were living in Mexico City at the time. And 2 of those kids, they were in Austin, Texas. They were going to school at the UT, and they flew down to Miami to talk to their grandparents, to basically tell them, hey, Mom and Dad want to take us to Cuba. What do you think? That shows you the mental state of our community. And lucky enough, both my mother and my father told the kids, go, because if you're going to do positive things about it, you need to know what's there. You need to know what's going on. And so they basically asked permission from my parents for them to go, and they all went. And I tell you, they came back with, and don't get me wrong, they were, extreme. They came back with a total new philosophy. Their values did not change one iota. Their values did not change one iota. But they came back with a total different perspective of how we need to engage the Cubans. One of my sons is an artist, and he went to la Escuela de Arte y Oficio in La Habana. And he walked in, and he spent 3 or 4 hours back there. We finally got a cab and came back to the hotel, and he came back totally disappointed because he thought that he was going to find a bunch of art, and what he found was just political rhetoric. And so they learned a lot of things. We took him out of Havana. We took him to Camagüey. We really took him all over Cuba. We spent, I think it was close to 16, 17 days. And I think they came back with a different perspective, with there's the same values and morals and ethics and views that they had before, but now I think they were strengthened by the fact that they went to Cuba. So my parents are gone. My mother was one, by the way, that says, whoever's living in my house in Cardenas, I'm going to get it back. I'm going to kick those blankety blanket. And you go back. I understand her point of view. And when I went back, by the way, to that house, when you're 11, you think this is this huge house, right? And you go back, and it wasn't. So I said, I really don't care about my house. But if you talk to my mother, those SOBs, I'm going to have. And then the same thing with my kids. So I think that generational change is happening. And yes, it's certainly happening with not all, but certainly with the majority of young Cubans, particularly, again, those Cubans that have come to the U.S. In the last 20 or 30 years.
A lot of negative things about NAFTA and other free trade agreements and how they negatively impacted the Mexican economy. Can I get your opinion?
NAFTA has not in any way, shape, or form, if you look at the data and if you look at the hard data, has not in any way, shape, or form impacted certainly the U.S. economy. I remember when I was in Mexico City was the time that NAFTA was being worked on, and Florida was one of those states because of our agricultural sector that were very concerned about NAFTA, i.e. tomatoes and other type of winter vegetables, the impact that they could have in our industry, particularly in Homestead in South Florida. And if you go back to the record and you go back to the data, it really didn't have any impact. I'm a free trade guy. So I do believe in globalization. I believe that whether we like it or not, it's a phenomenon that we have before of us. It's a phenomenon that we have to learn how to manage. Is it all good? No, it isn't. But certainly we have to create the business opportunities by which countries can trade among themselves. I don't believe that trade barriers, any type of trade barriers, are beneficial. We were talking about ethanol. There is no better, from the energy point of view, from the cost of energy point of view, there is no better ethanol than that produced from sugarcane. The most efficient ethanol today is sugarcane ethanol, not corn-based ethanol. But corn-based ethanol is subsidized two ways. It's subsidized because we give the U.S. farmers about 51 cents a gallon in order for them to grow corn to make ethanol. But we also put an import tariff of about 52 cents a gallon for Brazilian ethanol to come to the U.S. That's counterproductive. But again, I'm not a NAFTA expert. I have worked in NAFTA back in the 90s. But all that I can tell you is that managed free trade in which both countries recognize that they have a mutual benefit for whatever the commodity or the product happens to be, I think is beneficial. And by the way, also today, the impact of NAFTA, if you look at it, it's more global than regional. A lot of maquila operations have moved out of Mexico to the Far East. NAFTA didn't have anything to do with that. It was the growth of China and the growth of the Pacific Rim economy that really have an impact in Mexico. So if NAFTA had a negative impact in Mexico, it wasn't so much the threat that they have from Canadian and U.S. business, but it's how the growth happens to take place in places like India and China.
Do you think there's any potential in Ecuador or anywhere else in Latin America for an economy based more on ecotourism?
First of all, let me address the issue of oil, and not only from the Ecuador point of view, but I joined, as soon as I graduated from Gainesville, I went to work for Shell. Shell was my first employer when I left Gainesville, and ever since then, we always said we're running out of oil and we're going to run out of oil. And here we are still today, with world production capacity at 83 million barrels of oil a day, and new fields being found in deep waters offshore Angola and Brazil, for example, which are going to add in the next 10 to 15 years, is going to add probably another 10 to 12 million barrels of new production of oil. So the issue with Ecuador as far as oil running out, I don't think that is the case. to the surprise, I'm sure, of many of you, and I'm not a geologist, but it's to the surprise of many of you, when you find an oil reservoir is not like a cup in which the oil is liquid. It's really geological formations, and the oil is in the geological structure itself. And usually your recovery factor is no more than 25, 30, maybe 40%. So for example, in Ecuador, for every barrel that they pump out, or for every 100 barrels that they pump out, there's still another 50 or 60 barrels that are left on the ground, in which you need new technology and able to pump it out. That's why for countries like Ecuador, it's so important for them to have a fiscal and a legal regime that will allow new technology and new capital to come into Ecuador to help produce that secondary oil supply that's there. So to your answer of Ecuador is, I think there is plenty of oil around. I think any type of green tourism or anything, it's positive. And by the way, they don't conflict with each other. In the case of Ecuador, I think Texaco made some strategic mistakes. In fact, we in the oil industry, there's a couple of test cases, and you guys ought to study them, of how or not to do things. One is the Exxon Valdez. I mean, any of you guys that want to write a paper or really take a look at how to do something or not to do it, take a look at how the Exxon Valdez was handled by Exxon. And another case is take a look at how Texaco handled the issue of environmental stewardship in Ecuador. I mean, they physically turned their backs on a lot of things that they should have been keeping an eye on. So again, ecotourism, and yes, I know I'm an oil man, so I have to be careful how I say it, but yes, ecotourism, and I think the industry can certainly work together. So yes, I think Ecuador and Peru and even the Amazonian region, I mean, they're saying about huge amount of natural gas on the Amazonian region. So the reason is, how do we manage that? How do we tap that resource? Keeping at the same time environmental standards that, by the way, we, the industry today, because of you guys, because of the shareholders, sure keep a very close eye on.